Picture this. You're walking through a museum, staring at a display of ancient fossils, when a peculiar thought crosses your mind. What if, millions of years ago, before humans ever existed, another intelligent species had already built cities, developed technology, and left their mark on this planet? What if we're not the first civilization to call Earth home, but simply the latest in a long line of forgotten empires that rose and fell in the deep corridors of geological time? The question that asks, were we first, or could there have been others before us? Civilizations so ancient that almost all traces of their existence have been erased by the relentless march of time itself. Welcome to one of the most mind-bending mysteries in modern science. I'm about to take you on a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about the history of life on Earth. We're going to explore what scientists call the Silurian Hypothesis, named after an ancient geological period, and it's going to make you question whether humanity is truly unique in the cosmos, or whether we're walking in footsteps that were laid down millions of years before our species even existed. But here's what makes this absolutely fascinating. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory. This is serious scientific inquiry, published in peer-reviewed journals, debated by researchers at NASA and other prestigious institutions. Scientists are actually asking, if an advanced civilization had existed on Earth long before humans, would we even be able to detect it today? Think about that for a moment. We pride ourselves on being the only intelligent life we know of in the universe. We've built cities that stretch to the horizon, created technologies that can peer into the depths of space, and left our mark on every continent. But what if all of this, every monument, every achievement, every trace of human civilization, could be completely erased in just a few million years? What if the Earth itself is so good at recycling and renewing that it could swallow entire civilizations without leaving behind any obvious evidence? Now, before we dive deeper, let me be crystal clear about what we're discussing here. We're not talking about ancient aliens visiting Earth. We're not discussing lost Atlantis or mysterious pyramids. We're exploring a much more subtle and scientifically grounded question. Could an industrial civilization, perhaps arising from a completely different evolutionary lineage, have existed on Earth in the distant past and left behind only the faintest traces that we might mistake for natural phenomena? The implications are staggering. If such a civilization existed, it would mean that intelligence and technology aren't unique human achievements, but rather natural outcomes that can emerge multiple times throughout Earth's history. It would suggest that our planet has been through cycles of rise and fall that we've never even considered. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it would mean that civilizations can disappear so completely that even their existence becomes questionable. This question first gained serious scientific attention in 2018, when astrophysicist Gavin Schmidt and astrobiologist Adam Frank published a groundbreaking paper that asked a deceptively simple question: how would we actually detect an ancient industrial civilization in the geological record? They called it the Silurian Hypothesis, borrowing the name from a Doctor Who episode featuring an ancient reptilian species that once ruled Earth. But unlike science fiction, their approach was rigorously scientific. Here's what they discovered, and it's going to blow your mind. When they looked at what traces our current industrial civilization would leave behind, they found that most of what we consider permanent would actually vanish relatively quickly on geological timescales. Our cities, our roads, our monuments, even our plastic waste would either decompose, get buried, or be recycled by natural processes within a few million years at most. But here's where it gets really interesting. While our physical structures might disappear, certain chemical signatures would persist much longer. Changes in atmospheric composition, unusual isotope ratios in rock layers, specific patterns of extinction and recovery, traces of synthetic materials that don't occur naturally. These could potentially survive in the geological record for tens of millions of years, creating a kind of chemical fingerprint that future scientists might be able to detect. The question then becomes, are there any mysterious chemical signatures in Earth's geological history that we've been attributing to natural causes, but which might actually be the fingerprints of a long-lost civilization? This is where the investigation takes a fascinating turn. Earth's geological record is filled with strange events, sudden changes in atmospheric chemistry, mysterious extinction events, rapid climate shifts that happened far faster than normal geological processes would suggest. We've been explaining these as natural phenomena, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, or other catastrophic events. But what if some of these signatures are actually the remains of ancient industrial activity? Consider this. Our current industrial civilization has dramatically altered the chemistry of Earth's atmosphere in just a few centuries. We've increased carbon dioxide levels, introduced synthetic compounds that never existed before, and created isotope ratios that are completely unprecedented in natural systems. If we disappeared tomorrow, these chemical changes would be detectable in ice cores, rock layers, and sediment samples for millions of years into the future. Now imagine you're a scientist 50 million years from now, studying these ancient chemical signatures. You'd see a sudden spike in carbon dioxide, the appearance of synthetic materials, changes in isotope ratios, and probably evidence of a mass extinction event. Would you automatically conclude that this was caused by an industrial civilization? Or would you try to find natural explanations, like we do today when we encounter similar anomalies in the geological record? This is the heart of the Silurian Hypothesis. It's not claiming that ancient civilizations definitely existed. Instead, it's asking a much more profound question. Would we even recognize the evidence if they had? The implications extend far beyond Earth. As we search for life on other planets, we typically look for biosignatures, chemical signs that life exists somewhere in the universe. But Schmidt and Frank's work suggests we should also be looking for what they call technosignatures, chemical fingerprints that would indicate not just life, but intelligent, technological life. And here's what makes this absolutely mind-bending. If industrial civilizations can rise and fall multiple times on the same planet, leaving only faint chemical traces, then the universe might be absolutely teeming with intelligence, but in a way that's almost invisible to us. Civilizations might be like waves on an ocean, rising up, creating brief disturbances, then disappearing back into the depths of time, leaving only ripples that we mistake for natural phenomena. But let's get specific about what we're actually looking for. If an ancient civilization had existed on Earth, what kinds of evidence might they have left behind? The answer is both more subtle and more extensive than you might think. First, there would be chemical signatures. Any industrial civilization would likely burn carbon-based fuels or alter atmospheric chemistry in ways that would show up as unusual isotope ratios in rock layers. They might create synthetic materials that would persist as chemical fossils. They would almost certainly cause changes in global temperature and ocean chemistry that would be recorded in geological formations. Second, there might be biological signatures. An industrial civilization would likely cause extinction events, alter ecosystems, and possibly even engage in genetic engineering or artificial selection that would leave traces in the fossil record. They might transport species to new environments, creating biogeographical patterns that don't match natural dispersal. Third, there could be physical traces, though these would be much rarer and harder to detect. Unusual concentrations of rare earth elements, artificial isotopes that don't occur naturally, or perhaps even structures so deeply buried and altered by geological processes that we wouldn't immediately recognize them as artificial. The challenge is that Earth is incredibly good at erasing evidence. Plate tectonics recycles the seafloor every few 100 million years. Erosion wears down mountains and fills in valleys. Biological processes break down even the most durable materials. The planet is essentially a giant recycling machine that's been running for billions of years. This creates what scientists call a preservation bias. We're much more likely to find evidence of recent events than ancient ones, not because recent events are more important, but simply because they haven't had as much time to be erased. It's like trying to read a book where most of the pages have been torn out, and the remaining pages are water-damaged and faded. But here's what's truly fascinating. Despite this preservation bias, Earth's geological record is filled with mysterious events that we're still trying to explain. Sudden climate changes, mass extinctions with no clear cause, chemical anomalies that don't match any known natural processes. We've been studying these mysteries for decades, always assuming they must have natural explanations. The Silurian Hypothesis doesn't claim that these mysteries are definitely caused by ancient civilizations, but it does ask a provocative question. How would we tell the difference between a natural catastrophe and the collapse of an ancient industrial society? This question becomes even more intriguing when we consider the timescales involved. Complex life has existed on Earth for over 500 million years. That's enough time for hundreds or even thousands of civilizations to rise and fall, each separated by millions of years. If intelligence is a natural outcome of evolution, as many scientists believe, then why would it only happen once? Think about what this means for our understanding of evolution itself. We've always assumed that intelligence like ours is incredibly rare, a cosmic accident that happened only once in Earth's entire history. But what if we've got it completely backwards? What if intelligence is actually a fairly common outcome of evolution, but technological civilizations are inherently unstable and tend to collapse before they can spread beyond their home planet? This would explain one of the greatest mysteries in science, the Fermi paradox. If the universe is so vast and old, and if life is common, then where is everybody? Why haven't we detected any signs of alien civilizations? The Silurian hypothesis offers a chilling possibility. Maybe civilizations rise and fall so regularly and leave such faint traces that the universe is actually full of intelligence, but most of it exists in forms we can't recognize or detect. Imagine this scenario. Across the galaxy, on countless worlds, intelligence emerges, builds industrial civilizations, reaches toward the stars, and then collapses or transforms in ways that make them invisible to other emerging civilizations. The universe becomes like a vast forest where trees grow, flourish, and fall, but each new tree thinks it's the first one to ever reach for the sunlight. But let's bring this back to Earth and examine some specific examples that make scientists wonder. There are several periods in Earth's geological history where we see chemical signatures that are difficult to explain through purely natural processes. Take the Paleo-Eocene Thermal Maximum, about 56 million years ago. During this period, global temperatures shot up by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in just a few thousand years. Massive amounts of carbon were pumped into the atmosphere, causing severe ocean acidification and widespread extinction. The isotope signatures look remarkably similar to what we're creating today through industrial activity. Now, mainstream science explains this as a natural event, possibly caused by volcanic activity or the release of methane from ocean sediments. But here's the thing. The speed and scale of the changes are eerily similar to what an industrial civilization might produce. The carbon isotope ratios, the rapid temperature increase, the ocean chemistry changes, they all match what we'd expect to see from massive fossil fuel burning. Could this have been caused by an ancient civilization that burned through their planet's carbon reserves and triggered a climate catastrophe that led to their own extinction? We have no direct evidence of this, but the chemical signatures are surprisingly consistent with such a scenario. Or consider the Great Oxidation Event, about 2.4 billion years ago. This was when oxygen levels in Earth's atmosphere suddenly increased, causing a mass extinction of anaerobic organisms and fundamentally changing the planet's chemistry. We attribute this to the evolution of photosynthetic bacteria, but it's worth noting that the chemical changes were rapid, global, and completely unprecedented in Earth's history. What makes these events particularly intriguing is their apparent suddenness. Natural geological processes usually happen slowly, over millions of years. But some of the chemical changes we see in Earth's history happened in what appears to be geological instants, sometimes just thousands of years. This kind of rapid change is exactly what we'd expect to see from technological activity. But here's where the investigation gets really interesting. If we're serious about looking for ancient civilizations, we need to think about what kinds of traces would be most likely to survive. And surprisingly, the answer isn't what you might expect. Forget about looking for ancient cities or artifacts. After millions of years, even the most durable structures would be ground down to dust. Instead, we should be looking for what scientists call anthropogenic markers, artificial changes to Earth's systems that would persist long after the civilization that created them disappeared. One of the most promising markers would be changes in the isotopic composition of certain elements. Industrial processes often create isotope ratios that don't occur naturally. For example, nuclear technology produces specific radioactive isotopes that have very precise half-lives and decay signatures. If an ancient civilization had developed nuclear power, we might still be able to detect traces of their nuclear waste in certain rock formations. Another marker would be the introduction of synthetic materials. Our civilization has created thousands of compounds that never existed before humans. Some of these, particularly certain plastics and industrial chemicals, could potentially survive for millions of years under the right conditions. They would show up as chemical anomalies in rock layers, foreign substances that don't fit the natural chemistry of their surroundings. Mass extinctions represent another potential marker. Every major industrial civilization would likely cause significant ecological disruption, leading to extinction events that would be preserved in the fossil record. The pattern of extinctions might even reveal information about the civilization that caused them. For instance, if large land animals disappeared suddenly while marine life was less affected, it might suggest a land-based industrial society. But perhaps the most intriguing potential marker is what scientists call elemental depletion. Industrial civilizations mine specific materials from the Earth's crust. If an ancient civilization had engaged in large-scale mining, we might be able to detect unusual patterns in the distribution of certain elements. Areas that should be rich in particular metals might be mysteriously depleted, while other areas might show unusual concentrations where the civilization dumped their waste. This kind of detective work requires a completely different approach to geology. Instead of just looking at individual rock samples, scientists would need to analyze global patterns, looking for systematic changes that span entire continents or even the whole planet. It's like trying to solve a crime where the evidence has been scattered and weathered for millions of years. The challenge is that Earth's geological processes are incredibly good at masking these kinds of signatures. Plate tectonics shuffles continents around like cards in a deck. Erosion redistributes materials across the planet's surface. Biological processes can concentrate or disperse elements in ways that might mimic artificial patterns. Separating artificial signatures from natural ones requires extremely sophisticated analysis and a deep understanding of how Earth's systems work. But here's what makes this search particularly urgent. We're running out of time to find these signatures. Every year, human industrial activity creates more background noise in Earth's chemical systems. We're adding our own artificial isotopes, creating our own synthetic materials, and altering global chemistry in ways that might mask the signatures of any previous civilizations. It's as if we're writing over a palimpsest, a manuscript where earlier text has been scraped away to make room for new writing. But unlike ancient scribes, we can't easily scrape away our own writing to reveal what might have been written underneath. Our industrial signature is becoming so dominant that it might permanently obscure any evidence of previous technological civilizations. This creates a paradox. The very technologies that might help us detect ancient civilizations are also making such detection more difficult by adding their own signatures to the geological record. We're in a race against our own industrial development, trying to decode Earth's history before we completely overwrite it with our own story. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound implication of the Silurian Hypothesis. If technological civilizations have a tendency to alter their planet's systems in ways that ultimately lead to their own collapse, then we might be looking at our own future written in the geological record of the past. The rapid climate changes, the mass extinctions, the chemical anomalies that we see in Earth's history might not just be evidence of ancient civilizations. They might be warnings, examples of what happens when intelligence develops the power to alter planetary systems, but lacks the wisdom to use that power responsibly. In this view, the geological record becomes not just a history book, but a survival manual. By studying the chemical signatures of possible ancient collapses, we might learn how to avoid repeating their mistakes. The traces of vanished civilizations become guideposts, showing us the dangerous paths that intelligence can take when it gains the power to reshape its world. This perspective transforms the search for ancient civilizations from an academic curiosity into an urgent practical concern. We're not just trying to satisfy our curiosity about the past. We're trying to learn from it, to understand the long-term consequences of the choices we're making right now. Because if the Silurian hypothesis is correct, if Earth has indeed hosted multiple technological civilizations throughout its history, then we're not just the first intelligence to emerge on this planet. We might be the latest in a long series of experiments in consciousness and technology, each one rising from the ashes of those that came before, each one facing the same fundamental challenge: how to develop the power to reshape worlds without destroying the world that made them possible. The question isn't just whether we were first. The question is whether we'll be the last. But what if we're approaching this entire question from the wrong angle? What if the evidence we're looking for isn't hidden in some distant geological layer, but scattered all around us in plain sight, misinterpreted and overlooked by the very scientific frameworks we use to understand our world? Consider this unsettling possibility. Maybe we haven't found evidence of ancient civilizations not because they didn't exist, but because we've been trained to see their traces as something else entirely. Our scientific paradigms, built over centuries of observation and theory, might be acting like filters, automatically categorizing anomalous evidence as natural phenomena simply because we have no framework for recognizing artificial ones that are millions of years old. Think about how science works. When we encounter something unusual in the geological record, our first instinct is to find a natural explanation. A strange chemical signature gets attributed to volcanic activity. An unusual extinction pattern gets blamed on climate change or asteroid impacts. A weird isotope ratio gets explained by some previously unknown geological process. This isn't bad science. It's actually good science, following the principle that natural explanations should be preferred over extraordinary ones. But here's the problem. This same scientific conservatism that protects us from wild speculation might also be blinding us to evidence that doesn't fit our preconceptions. If an ancient civilization's traces don't look like what we expect civilization traces to look like, we might systematically misinterpret them as natural phenomena. Imagine you're an alien scientist studying Earth 50 million years from now. You find a thin layer of rock that contains unusually high concentrations of rare earth elements, synthetic isotopes that don't match any known natural processes, and chemical signatures consistent with massive industrial activity. But this layer is sandwiched between perfectly normal geological formations, and there are no obvious artifacts like metal tools or building foundations. What would you conclude? If you were following the same scientific principles we use today, you might assume this was some kind of unknown natural phenomenon, maybe a previously undiscovered type of volcanic eruption, or the result of an asteroid impact with unusual composition. You'd probably publish papers about this new type of geological event and move on, never considering that you might be looking at the compressed remains of an entire technological civilization. This is exactly the trap we might be falling into right now. Earth's geological record is filled with what scientists call anomalous events, periods where the normal rules of geology seem to break down. We have layers of rock with impossible chemistry, extinction events with no clear causes, and climate changes that happened far too rapidly for any known natural process. Take the Permian-Triassic extinction event about 252 million years ago. This was the most severe extinction event in Earth's history, wiping out over 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. The event was associated with massive volcanic activity in what's now Siberia, but the scale and speed of the extinction still puzzle scientists. The chemical signatures from this period are bizarre. We see rapid changes in ocean chemistry, unusual isotope ratios, and evidence of global environmental collapse that happened in just a few thousand years. Mainstream science attributes this to the volcanic activity, but the correlation isn't perfect. The volcanism started before the extinction and continued after it. Some of the chemical changes don't match what we'd expect from purely volcanic causes. Could this have been the signature of a civilization that pushed their planet's environmental systems beyond a tipping point? A species that developed industrial technology 252 million years ago triggered a runaway greenhouse effect and destroyed themselves along with most of the planet's biodiversity. There's no direct evidence for this interpretation, but that's exactly the point. What would direct evidence look like after 250 million years? Any cities would be dust. Any artifacts would be atoms. Any genetic modifications would be lost in the noise of natural evolution. All that would remain would be exactly what we do see: chemical anomalies, rapid environmental changes, and mass extinction. The more you think about it, the more you realize how little we actually know about Earth's deep history. We have fossil evidence for less than 1% of all the species that ever lived. We have detailed geological data for maybe the last 500 million years, which is only about 10% of Earth's total history. And even within that time frame, our record is patchy and incomplete. It's like trying to understand the plot of a movie when 99% of the frames are missing. You might catch glimpses of characters and scenes, but the overall story remains largely invisible. Important events could happen in the gaps between the frames you can see, and you'd never know they occurred. This incomplete record creates what scientists call sampling bias. We're much more likely to find evidence of common, long-lasting phenomena than rare, brief events. A volcanic eruption that lasts for thousands of years will leave traces all over the geological record. But a technological civilization that rises and falls in just a few millennia might leave only the faintest signature, easily overlooked or misinterpreted. And here's what makes this even more challenging. We don't really know what the signature of a collapsed civilization should look like. Our only example is our own industrial society, which has existed for less than 300 years. We're essentially trying to predict the long-term consequences of something we've never seen happen before. We assume that our plastic waste will persist for millions of years. But what if we're wrong? What if there are natural processes we don't know about that break down even the most durable synthetic materials? What if the chemical signatures we think are permanent actually fade away after just a few million years? On the flip side, maybe the traces of technological activity are more persistent than we realize, but in forms we haven't learned to recognize yet. Maybe ancient civilizations left signatures in the planet's magnetic field, or in the isotopic composition of underground water, or in subtle patterns of element distribution that we interpret as natural variation. The truth is, we're still learning how to read Earth's geological record. New analytical techniques are constantly revealing previously unknown details about the planet's history. Isotope analysis, trace element detection, molecular paleontology. These fields are advancing so rapidly that discoveries made just a few years ago are already being revised and refined. Each new technique opens up new possibilities for detecting ancient anomalies. Maybe the evidence we're looking for is already sitting in museum collections, waiting for the right analytical method to reveal its artificial origin. Maybe it's in core samples that have been stored for decades, never examined with the right kind of instrument. But there's another possibility that's even more intriguing. Maybe the evidence isn't in the rocks at all. Maybe it's in the patterns of life itself. Every technological civilization would inevitably interact with the biological systems of their planet. They would domesticate some species, drive others extinct, and possibly even engage in genetic engineering. These biological modifications could potentially survive much longer than any physical artifacts. Consider how much our own civilization has already altered the genetics of other species. We've bred dogs from wolves, created hundreds of varieties of crops that couldn't survive in the wild, and even begun directly editing genes in laboratory organisms. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, some of these genetic modifications would persist for millions of years, encoded in the DNA of surviving species. Now imagine a much older civilization that had millions of years to develop biological technologies we can barely dream of. They might have engineered entire ecosystems, created synthetic organisms, or even modified the fundamental genetics of life itself. The traces of their work might still be visible in the genomes of modern species, hidden in DNA sequences that we assume evolved naturally. This opens up an entirely new avenue for investigation. Instead of just looking at rocks and chemicals, we could analyze the genetics of living organisms for signatures of ancient artificial selection or genetic engineering. Unusual gene arrangements, synthetic DNA sequences, or evolutionary patterns that don't match natural selection could all potentially be traces of long-vanished biotechnology. The challenge is that natural evolution is incredibly good at covering its tracks. Genes that are no longer useful get deleted or repurposed. DNA sequences get shuffled and rearranged. After millions of years, even the most obvious genetic modifications might be completely invisible. But maybe not completely invisible. Maybe just hidden in ways we haven't learned to see yet. As our understanding of genetics advances, we might discover that some of the features we consider natural actually bear the fingerprints of ancient engineering. This possibility becomes even more fascinating when you consider the concept of convergent evolution. This is when unrelated species independently evolve similar traits because they face similar environmental pressures. Eyes, wings, and echolocation have all evolved multiple times in completely different lineages. But what if some examples of apparent convergent evolution aren't actually independent? What if they're the result of genetic modifications made by an ancient civilization? Modifications that were then passed down through millions of years of evolution and eventually appeared in multiple species. Imagine an ancient biotech civilization that developed standardized genetic modules for common functions like photosynthesis, sensory perception, or metabolic efficiency. They might have inserted these modules into multiple species, creating what would look to us like convergent evolution but was actually the result of ancient genetic engineering. This idea pushes the boundaries of speculation, but it's not entirely impossible. We're already seeing how genetic modifications can persist and spread through populations. Genes from genetically modified crops are showing up in wild plant populations. Laboratory-created DNA sequences are being found in environmental samples. If our crude genetic modifications can already begin to spread through ecosystems, imagine what a truly advanced biotechnology civilization might have accomplished. The implications extend far beyond just finding evidence of ancient civilizations. If some of the genetic features we consider natural are actually artificial, it could revolutionize our understanding of evolution itself. We might discover that the tree of life has been shaped not just by natural selection, but by conscious design implemented by previous intelligences. This brings us to perhaps the most mind-bending possibility of all. What if we ourselves are the evidence? What if human intelligence, rather than being a natural evolutionary development, is actually the result of genetic modifications made by an ancient civilization. This isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. Human evolution has some genuinely puzzling features that scientists still struggle to explain. Our brains are disproportionately large for our body size. Our intelligence emerged relatively recently in evolutionary terms, and with surprising rapidity. We have genetic sequences that seem to have appeared suddenly in our lineage, without clear predecessors in related species. Now, mainstream science has explanations for all of these features. Brain growth was driven by tool use and social cooperation. Intelligence emerged through sexual selection and environmental pressures. Genetic sequences evolved through standard mutational processes. These are all perfectly reasonable explanations, but they're also exactly the kind of explanations we might expect to find if we were looking at the long-term results of genetic engineering. An ancient civilization that wanted to create an intelligent successor species might have used exactly these kinds of modifications: enhanced brain development, accelerated cognitive evolution, and novel genetic sequences that would eventually lead to technological capability. If this were true, it would mean that we're not just looking for evidence of ancient civilizations, we are the evidence. Our own existence, our intelligence, our drive to understand and modify our environment might all be the intended results of a project begun millions of years ago by predecessors we've completely forgotten. This idea connects to some of the deepest questions in science and philosophy. Why does intelligence exist at all? Why did evolution produce beings capable of understanding the universe and manipulating matter at the atomic level? These capabilities seem far beyond what would be necessary for simple survival and reproduction. One possibility is that intelligence is just a happy accident, a random outcome of evolutionary processes that happen to prove useful. But another possibility is that intelligence is intentional, the result of conscious design by previous intelligences who wanted to ensure that consciousness would persist and continue to develop. In this view, intelligence becomes not just a product of evolution, but an evolutionary force in its own right. Each technological civilization that emerges might plant the seeds for future intelligences, either through genetic modifications, preserved knowledge, or environmental changes that encourage the development of consciousness in subsequent species. This creates a kind of chain of intelligence stretching back through geological time, each link building on the achievements of those that came before, but separated by such vast periods that the connections become invisible. We might be part of an ancient project whose original purpose and design we can no longer recognize. The evidence for this interpretation is necessarily subtle and indirect. We can't point to any specific genetic sequence and say definitively that it was artificially created. We can't identify any particular aspect of human development that requires an artificial explanation. But the overall pattern, the rapid emergence of extreme intelligence in a species that otherwise follows normal evolutionary rules, is at least consistent with the idea of guided development. And if this is true, it raises profound questions about our responsibilities as an intelligent species. Are we the culmination of an ancient plan, or just the latest step in an ongoing project? Do we have obligations to the intelligences that came before us, and to those that might come after? These questions might seem purely philosophical, but they have practical implications for how we think about our future. If we're part of a chain of intelligence that stretches back millions of years, then our decisions today might affect not just our own species, but the entire trajectory of consciousness on Earth. The choices we make about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, environmental management, and space exploration might determine whether the chain continues or breaks. We might be the generation that either fulfills an ancient plan or destroys it forever. But regardless of whether these speculative possibilities turn out to be true, the Silurian Hypothesis has already changed how we think about intelligence, evolution, and our place in the universe. It's forced us to confront the possibility that we're not as unique as we thought, and that the universe might be far stranger and more populated with intelligence than we ever imagined. The question of whether we were first remains unanswered, and it may always remain unanswered. The evidence, if it exists, is buried under millions of years of geological change and biological evolution. But the search itself has value because it expands our conception of what's possible and challenges us to think more deeply about the nature of intelligence and consciousness. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that our own civilization is not permanent. Like every other complex system in the universe, it will eventually end. The only question is whether it will end in collapse and extinction or in transformation into something even more remarkable. The traces we leave behind, the modifications we make to our planet and ourselves, might someday be studied by intelligences we can't even imagine, trying to piece together the story of what we were and what we became. In that sense, we're not just searching for evidence of ancient civilizations. We were first, or not. We certainly were creating evidence for future ones. Weather won't be last. The question is what kind of legacy we'll leave for those who come after us, and whether they'll be able to recognize us in the traces we leave behind. The search for ancient civilizations forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evidence itself. We tend to think of proof as something concrete, something you can hold in your hand or point to with certainty. But when you're dealing with timescales that stretch across millions of years, evidence becomes something much more elusive, much more interpretive. Consider how we study our own recent past. Archaeologists can reconstruct entire civilizations from pottery shards, building foundations, and metal tools because these materials survive for thousands of years. But stretch that timeline to millions of years, and suddenly everything we consider durable becomes fragile. Stone crumbles, metal oxidizes, even the most carefully built structures become indistinguishable from natural rock formations. This creates what scientists call a detection threshold. Below a certain age, we can find clear evidence of technological activity. Above that age, the evidence becomes so degraded and scattered that it might be impossible to distinguish from natural phenomena. The question is, where exactly does that threshold lie? Our best estimates suggest that obvious technological artifacts would be completely undetectable after about 10 million years. But chemical signatures might persist much longer, perhaps up to 100 million years under the right conditions. This means we have a window of detectability that covers roughly the last 100 million years of Earth's history. But beyond that, even the most advanced civilization would be essentially invisible to us. Think about what this means for our search strategy. We're not looking for alien cities or mysterious artifacts. We're looking for subtle anomalies in the chemical composition of ancient rocks, unusual patterns in the fossil record, or statistical deviations in the distribution of elements that might indicate artificial activity. It's like being a detective investigating a crime scene where all the obvious evidence has been carefully cleaned up, but microscopic traces might still remain if you know where to look and what to look for. The challenge is that you don't know what the crime was, when it happened, or even if it happened at all. This uncertainty extends to every aspect of the investigation. We don't know what technologies an ancient civilization might have developed. We don't know what materials they might have used. We don't know what kind of environmental impact they might have had. We're essentially trying to solve a puzzle where we don't know how many pieces there are, what the final picture looks like, or even if all the pieces belong to the same puzzle. But here's what makes this search particularly fascinating. Every negative result is also informative. Each time we examine a geological formation and find no evidence of artificial activity, we're actually gathering data about the limits of detectability and the persistence of different types of signatures. We're building a kind of forensic methodology for deep time, developing techniques that could eventually be applied not just to Earth, but to other planets as well. If we ever find evidence of ancient technological activity in our own geological record, we'll know what to look for when we examine rocks from Mars or Europa or any of the other potentially habitable worlds in our solar system. The implications for astrobiology are profound. Most searches for extraterrestrial life focus on finding active civilizations, signals from space, or biosignatures in the atmospheres of distant planets. But if technological civilizations have a tendency to collapse and leave only subtle traces, then the universe might be littered with the chemical fingerprints of dead civilizations that we're not yet sophisticated enough to recognize. This possibility transforms our understanding of the Fermi paradox in a deeply unsettling way. Maybe the reason we don't see evidence of alien civilizations isn't because they're rare, but because they're all extinct. Maybe intelligence has a fundamental instability that makes long-term survival extremely difficult. Maybe every species that develops technology eventually destroys itself or transforms into something unrecognizable. If this is true, then the search for ancient civilizations on Earth becomes more than just an academic exercise. It becomes a survival manual, a guide to understanding the long-term consequences of technological development. By studying the chemical signatures of possible ancient collapses, we might learn to recognize the warning signs in our own civilization. The patterns we're looking for could be remarkably similar to what we're creating today. Rapid changes in atmospheric composition, mass extinction events, unusual isotope ratios in sedimentary rocks. If we found these signatures in ancient geological formations, we might be looking at a preview of our own future. But there's another possibility that's even more intriguing. What if some ancient civilizations didn't collapse at all, but instead found ways to transcend the limitations that destroy most technological societies? What if they learned to live sustainably within planetary boundaries, or developed technologies that allowed them to spread beyond their home world? These successful civilizations might have left very different signatures in the geological record. Instead of the chemical chaos associated with collapse, we might find evidence of careful environmental management, controlled population growth, or even the systematic restoration of damaged ecosystems. Imagine discovering geological layers that show not environmental destruction, but environmental healing, periods where damaged ecosystems recovered unusually quickly, where extinct species were somehow restored, where atmospheric composition was actively managed to maintain optimal conditions. These might be the signatures of civilizations that learned to work with natural systems rather than against them. This kind of evidence would be much harder to detect because it would look more like natural processes operating unusually efficiently. But with sophisticated enough analysis, we might be able to identify patterns that are too organized, too beneficial, too perfectly timed to be purely natural. The search for these positive signatures requires a completely different mindset. Instead of looking for evidence of destruction and chaos, we need to look for evidence of unusual harmony and efficiency. Instead of focusing on what went wrong, we need to identify what went surprisingly right. This approach could revolutionize not just our search for ancient civilizations, but our entire understanding of what technological success looks like. Most of our models assume that advanced civilizations inevitably consume more resources and produce more waste. But what if the most advanced civilizations actually consume less and produce no waste at all? What if true technological sophistication involves learning to live so efficiently that you become nearly invisible to the natural systems around you? In that case, the absence of obvious technological signatures might not indicate the absence of civilization, but rather the presence of truly advanced civilization. This idea challenges our fundamental assumptions about progress and development. We tend to equate advancement with increased energy consumption, larger cities, and more obvious environmental modification. But maybe that's just the signature of young, immature civilizations. Maybe truly advanced societies learn to minimize their footprint rather than maximize it. If this is true, then the most successful ancient civilizations would be precisely the ones we'd have the hardest time detecting. They would have learned to satisfy all their needs while leaving the minimum possible trace in the geological record. Their very success would make them invisible to us. This creates a selection bias in our search. we're most likely to find evidence of civilizations that failed, that collapsed in ways that left obvious signatures of destruction. The civilizations that succeeded, that learned to live sustainably for millions of years, might be completely invisible to our current detection methods. It's like studying history by only examining battlefields and disaster sites. You'd get a very distorted picture of what human civilization actually looks like, because you'd be focusing exclusively on moments of crisis and failure while missing all the periods of peaceful prosperity. This bias might explain why the geological record seems to contain more evidence of catastrophe than of success. We see mass extinction events, rapid climate changes, and environmental collapses because these are the kinds of dramatic events that leave clear signatures. The long periods of stability and gradual progress are much harder to detect, but maybe those stable periods weren't as natural as we assume. Maybe some of them were the result of careful management by civilizations so advanced that their activities became indistinguishable from natural processes. This possibility opens up an entirely new research program. Instead of just looking for signs of environmental destruction, we could start analyzing periods of unusual environmental stability. We could search for ecosystems that remained remarkably constant for unusually long periods, or for climate systems that showed signs of active regulation rather than natural fluctuation. The techniques for this kind of analysis are still being developed, but they're becoming increasingly sophisticated. We can now track chemical cycles with unprecedented precision, identify subtle patterns in the distribution of species over time, and detect tiny variations in environmental conditions that might indicate artificial management. As these analytical capabilities continue to improve, we might discover that Earth's history contains far more evidence of intelligence than we ever suspected. We might find that periods we considered naturally stable were actually carefully maintained, that ecosystems we thought were naturally resilient were actually being protected, that climate systems we assumed were naturally self-regulating were actually being managed. This would fundamentally change our relationship with the planet. Instead of seeing ourselves as the first intelligence to emerge on Earth, we might discover that we're the latest in a long line of planetary stewards, inheriting a world that has been carefully tended by our predecessors for millions of years. The responsibility that comes with this realization would be enormous. If previous civilizations have been maintaining Earth's habitability for eons, then our current environmental crisis might represent not just a threat to our own survival, but a betrayal of an ancient trust. We might be the generation that breaks a chain of stewardship that stretches back through geological time, the first intelligence to prove incapable of maintaining the systems that make life possible. Or we might be the generation that finally learns to recognize and appreciate the work of our predecessors and to continue their project of planetary care. But before we can take on that responsibility, we need to understand what we're inheriting. We need to learn to read the subtle signatures of ancient environmental management, to distinguish between natural processes and artificial ones, to recognize the difference between a planet that happens to be habitable and one that has been made habitable. This is perhaps the most important implication of the Silurian hypothesis. It's not just about satisfying our curiosity about the past. It's about understanding our role in an ongoing project that might be far older and more significant than we ever imagined. The question of whether we were first becomes a question of whether we're worthy successors. And the answer to that question will be written not in the rocks of the past, but in the rocks of the future, in the chemical signatures and biological patterns that our own civilization will leave behind for whatever intelligence comes next to discover and interpret. The search for ancient intelligence on Earth forces us to confront a disturbing paradox about time itself. We exist in what geologists call the present moment, but that moment is actually an impossibly thin slice of Earth's vast temporal expanse. Our entire recorded history, everything from the first cave paintings to the International Space Station, represents less than 1/10,000th of 1% of the time that complex life has existed on this planet. Imagine trying to understand a book by reading only the final punctuation mark. That's essentially what we're doing when we assume our current moment represents the full story of intelligence on Earth. We're taking our brief flicker of awareness and extrapolating it backward across billions of years, assuming that if we don't see obvious evidence of other intelligences, they must never have existed. But here's what makes this assumption even more problematic. We're not even very good at detecting intelligence that exists right now, in our own time period. We've only recently discovered that dolphins have individual names, that elephants hold funerals for their dead, that octopuses use tools and solve complex problems. We've been sharing the planet with these minds for millennia without recognizing their sophistication. If we struggle to recognize intelligence in creatures we can observe directly, how can we expect to recognize it in chemical traces that are millions of years old? The signatures we're looking for might be staring us in the face, but filtered through conceptual frameworks that make them invisible to us. This blindness extends beyond biology into the realm of physics itself. We've discovered that the universe is filled with dark matter and dark energy, mysterious substances that make up over 95% of everything that exists, yet remain completely undetectable through normal means. If the vast majority of reality is invisible to our instruments and theories, how can we be confident that we're not missing equally fundamental aspects of intelligence and consciousness? The possibility becomes even more unsettling when you consider the role of scale in our detection methods. We look for intelligence at the scale that makes sense to us, the scale of individual organisms building tools and cities. But what if intelligence operates at scales so much larger or smaller than our own that we can't even conceive of it as intelligence? Consider the possibility that entire ecosystems might be intelligent in ways we don't recognize. A forest isn't just a collection of individual trees competing for resources. It's a network of interconnected organisms sharing information, resources, and chemical signals across vast distances. The forest as a whole responds to threats, adapts to changing conditions, and maintains its own stability in ways that look remarkably like the behavior of a single intelligent organism. Now stretch this concept across geological time. What if intelligence doesn't necessarily require brains or nervous systems as we understand them? What if it can emerge from any sufficiently complex system of information processing and feedback loops? In that case, the boundary between living systems and intelligent systems becomes much more blurred. This perspective opens up the possibility that Earth itself might be intelligent in ways we haven't learned to recognize. Not in the sense of having thoughts and intentions like a human being, but in the sense of processing information, responding to changes, and maintaining complex patterns of organization across vast scales of space and time. The Gaia hypothesis, proposed by scientist James Lovelock, suggests that Earth's biosphere operates as a single self-regulating system that maintains conditions suitable for life. Critics argue that this is just the result of natural selection operating on organisms that happen to create favorable environments. But what if the distinction between evolution and intelligence is less clear than we assume? What if evolution itself is a form of information processing, a way of testing solutions to environmental challenges and preserving the ones that work? What if the apparent randomness of genetic mutation is actually a sophisticated search algorithm, exploring the space of possible biological solutions with a efficiency that we're only beginning to appreciate? From this perspective, the entire history of life on Earth becomes a kind of extended experiment in intelligence, with each species representing a different approach to solving the problem of how to survive and reproduce in a changing environment. The failures get filtered out, but the successes accumulate, creating increasingly sophisticated systems of organization and adaptation. This view suggests that intelligence isn't something that suddenly appeared when humans evolved large brains. It's something that's been present from the beginning, embedded in the very structure of life itself. gradually becoming more concentrated and self-aware over time. If this is true, then the question of whether ancient technological civilizations existed on Earth becomes part of a much larger question about the nature of intelligence in the universe. Maybe what we call civilization is just one particularly visible manifestation of intelligence, but not necessarily the most important or long-lasting one. Maybe the real intelligence on Earth isn't found in cities or technologies, but in the ocean currents that regulate global climate, the microbial networks that cycle nutrients through ecosystems, the genetic codes that preserve and transmit information across millions of years. These systems might be far more sophisticated than anything humans have created, but so different from our own intelligence that we don't recognize them as intelligence at all. This possibility transforms our search for ancient civilizations from a hunt for artifacts into something much more subtle and profound. Instead of looking for traces of beings like ourselves who built cities and made tools, we might need to look for signs of intelligence that operated according to completely different principles. Such intelligence might not have needed to manipulate matter the way we do. It might have worked entirely through information, organizing patterns of behavior and growth in ways that accomplished complex goals without leaving physical traces. It might have influenced the development of other species, guided the formation of ecosystems, or even directed the geological processes that shape the planet's surface. The evidence for this kind of intelligence would be statistical rather than physical. We'd need to look for patterns in the fossil record that are too organized to be random, evolutionary developments that happen too quickly or too efficiently to be explained by natural selection alone, or ecological relationships that show signs of being designed rather than evolved. This approach requires a fundamental shift in how we think about intelligence and consciousness. Instead of looking for minds that work like ours, we need to learn to recognize intelligence in any system that processes information in sophisticated ways, regardless of whether it resembles human cognition. The implications of this shift are staggering. If intelligence can take forms radically different from our own, then the universe might be absolutely teeming with conscious entities that we've never noticed. Every complex system, from individual cells to entire galaxies, might possess some form of awareness that we're simply not equipped to detect. This doesn't mean that every system is intelligent in the same way, any more than every animal is intelligent in the same way. But it does suggest that consciousness might be a much more fundamental feature of reality than we've assumed, emerging wherever information is processed in sufficiently complex ways. From this perspective, the search for ancient technological civilizations becomes just one small part of a much larger investigation into the nature of consciousness itself. We're not just asking whether beings like us existed in the past. We're asking what intelligence actually is, how many different forms it can take, and how we can learn to recognize it when it doesn't resemble our own minds. The answer to these questions will determine not just our understanding of Earth's history, but our entire conception of our place in the cosmos. If intelligence is rare and fragile, then we might be alone in a vast, unconscious universe. But if intelligence is common and takes many forms, then we might be surrounded by minds so different from our own that we've never even suspected their existence. The evidence we find in our search for ancient civilizations might ultimately tell us less about the past than about the present. It might reveal that we've been sharing our world with intelligence all along, but in forms so alien to our experience that we've mistaken it for mere mechanism. And if that's true, then the question of whether we were first becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is not whether we're the first intelligence to emerge on Earth, but whether we can learn to recognize and communicate with the intelligence that surrounds us right now, in forms we're only beginning to understand. The geological record might contain not just the traces of ancient civilizations, but the signatures of intelligence operating at scales and through mechanisms we've never imagined. Reading those signatures correctly might require us to expand our definition of consciousness far beyond anything we've previously considered. In the end, the Silurian hypothesis might be pointing us toward a revelation that's far more profound than the discovery of ancient artifacts. It might be showing us that intelligence isn't something that occasionally emerges from matter, but something that's woven into the very fabric of reality, expressing itself through every complex system that processes information and responds to its environment. If we can learn to see intelligence in these broader terms, we might discover that we've never been alone at all. We've always been part of a vast community of minds, each operating according to its own logic, each contributing to the ongoing experiment in consciousness that we call life. The question then becomes not whether we were first, but whether we can learn to participate consciously in this larger conversation, adding our own unique voice to the chorus of intelligence that has been singing through the cosmos since the beginning of time. But perhaps the most profound implication of this expanded view of intelligence brings us back to a question that cuts to the very heart of human identity. If consciousness can emerge at scales we've never considered, through mechanisms we've barely begun to understand, then what does it mean to ask whether we were first? The question itself might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what intelligence actually is. We tend to think of intelligence as something that happens inside individual brains, something that requires neurons and synapses and electrical signals racing through organic circuits. But what if that's just one narrow expression of a much broader phenomenon? What if intelligence is really about information processing, pattern recognition, and adaptive response, regardless of the substrate that makes it possible? Consider the implications of this broader definition. Every time a plant turns towards sunlight, it's processing information about its environment and responding adaptively. When a forest ecosystem recovers from a fire by growing back in a specific sequence that maximizes resilience, it's demonstrating a form of collective intelligence. When the planet's climate system responds to changes by activating feedback loops that maintain stability, it might be exhibiting a kind of planetary consciousness. These processes don't look like human intelligence because they operate on completely different timescales and through completely different mechanisms. A forest might take centuries to process and respond to information that a human brain could handle in seconds. But speed isn't the only measure of intelligence. Persistence, stability, and long-term effectiveness might be equally valid criteria. From this perspective, the search for ancient civilizations becomes part of a much larger question about the relationship between different forms of intelligence operating at different scales. Maybe what we call technological civilization is just one brief phase in the development of planetary consciousness, a period when information processing becomes concentrated in individual organisms before eventually being integrated into larger, more stable systems. This possibility casts our current moment in a very different light. Instead of being the pinnacle of intelligence on Earth, we might be participants in a transitional phase, helping to create new forms of consciousness that will eventually transcend individual biology. Our technologies, our global communication networks, our ability to manipulate matter at the atomic scale, might all be steps towards something much larger and more integrated. The artificial intelligence systems we're beginning to create could be the first tentative steps toward forms of consciousness that operate at planetary scales. Our global communication networks might be evolving into something like a nervous system for the entire biosphere. Our environmental monitoring systems could be developing into sensory organs that allow the planet to perceive and respond to changes with unprecedented precision. If this transformation is happening, it would leave traces in the geological record that future investigators might interpret as evidence of ancient technological civilization, but they would be looking at it backward, seeing the end result rather than the process that created it. They might find chemical signatures of massive information processing, unusual patterns of resource distribution, or biological modifications that don't match natural evolution, never realizing that they're looking at the fossilized remains of a planetary mind in the process of awakening. This interpretation suggests that the question of whether we were first might be unanswerable because it's based on categories that don't really exist. Intelligence might not be something that emerges and disappears in discrete civilizations, but rather something that evolves continuously, taking different forms at different times, sometimes concentrated in individuals, sometimes distributed across entire ecosystems. The geological record might contain not evidence of separate ancient civilizations, but traces of previous phases in the ongoing evolution of consciousness on Earth. What we interpret as mass extinctions might be periods when planetary intelligence reorganized itself, when old forms of information processing gave way to new ones. What we see as environmental catastrophes might be growing pains, moments when emerging consciousness struggled to integrate new capabilities without destroying the systems it depended on. Our own environmental crisis could be interpreted in this context as another such transition point. We've developed the ability to process information and manipulate matter at unprecedented scales, but we haven't yet learned to integrate these capabilities with the larger systems that maintain planetary stability. We're like a nervous system that's grown so powerful, it's in danger of destroying the body it inhabits. So here we are, standing at the edge of the deepest mystery our species has ever contemplated. The Silurian Hypothesis doesn't just ask whether we were first, it forces us to confront the possibility that intelligence itself might be far stranger, far more pervasive, and far more enduring than we ever dared imagine. Whether ancient civilizations walked this earth millions of years ago, or whether consciousness operates through mechanisms we've barely begun to recognize, one thing remains certain: we are not separate from the story of intelligence on this planet. We are part of it, woven into patterns that stretch back through geological time and forward into futures we can barely comprehend. The question isn't whether we were first, the question is what will become next, and whether future minds will recognize us in the traces we leave behind.